The bash shell, what is it? Well, the bash shell is basically your interface to the kernel or the operating system on Linux. There's a lot of different types of shells that you can use on a Linux operating system, but the default shell in RHEL 7 or CentOS 7 and even the last few generations of Red Hat Enterprise and most versions of Linux that are out there today is bash. And bash stands for Born Again Shell. There used to be a Bourne shell. This was kind of an updated or an updated version of it that released some time ago. And now it's the Born Again shell, which we refer to as bash. Now, bash, like I said, is your interface between the user and the actual operating system or the kernel. And ironic enough, where we get the word shell from is an analogy with the kernel of the operating system. If you think about the kernel as the very center of a tree nut, the protective coating around the outside of it is a shell. And so if you think about that analogy, it may help to understand exactly what the shell is and how it works in relationship to the kernel. The shell is kind of on the outside where user space is, whereas the kernel is on the inside. And the shell sitting in user space is where we as users use that in order to interact with the operating system and send commands through the system call interface and ask the kernel to perform different functions for us. Now we do this through the shell using a command line interface, which we'll refer to as a CLI, command line interface. And on that command line interface, we will type a series of different commands in order to execute different functions on the operating system. Now, commands are organized in a very particular way on the bash command line. They're in a series of words, and the structure is always the very first word on the command line is the command, what you want to do. Everything preceding that command is going to be referred to as an argument. And any command can have 0 or an infinite amount of arguments. It really just depends on how the application is developed. But the important thing to understand on the bash shell command line is that the command and its subsequent arguments are all separated by white space. And the bash shell doesn't really care how much white space or what type of white space, whether it's a tab or 1 space or 3 spaces. All it knows is that when it sees white space, that is the end of the previous word, whether that's an argument or the command itself, and that whatever word follows the white space is going to be the next argument. And that's basically how the bash shell works, and in a sense, what the bash shell is. So now we're going to get into just a little demonstration of exactly what the bash shell is and get our hands dirty with it. In this example, we have a file called myfile. I'm going to use the cp command, also known as the copy command, to copy that file to another file called yourfile. To do that, I'm first going to type the command cp. Then we're going to press space. What space does is that inserts 1 character of white space. White space can either be a space character or a tab character when we're talking about the command line. So now the next thing that I type on the command line is going to be the very first argument to the command. As the first argument to this command, I'm going to type the name of the file I want to copy, so myfile. Then I'm going to type another space. That allows us to type in the second argument to the command cp. The command cp requires the second argument to be the name of the file or the name of the directory that I want to copy it to. In this case, I'm going to keep it in the same directory. I'm just going to call the file yourfile. So I'm copying the file myfile into another file called yourfile. When I press enter, it'll execute the command, and we can see that I now have 2 files. Pretty simple. Now in this next command, we're going to introduce some options. Some commands have options, some don't, some have more than others. It really just depends on what command you're using. This is a command you will end up using very frequently called grep. Grep basically allows you to search for strings within a file or within the output of another command, but we'll get to how to use it in that way later. Here we're just going to grep tac-i, which tells it to ignore the case of the letters that you're searching for, the word student. And our third argument is going to be the etc password file, or /etc/password. This file basically contains all the user accounts on the system. So what we're doing is we're just searching for our username, student, within that file etc/password. And again, the tac-i option tells the grep command to ignore whether or not the student is in lowercase or uppercase. When we press enter, we can see that it returns the line that it found within that file that had the word student inside of it. I can show you what it looks like with and without that option. For instance, if I looked for student with a capital S, it wouldn't return anything, because as we just saw with the previous command, the word student is in all lowercase. But if we add tac-i to it, it would then find that string because it doesn't care what case the string is in. So this is an example of using an option. Now an option is still technically an argument on the command line, because the only words that we have in the command line, the first one is the command, everything that follows it is an argument. But in some cases, with some commands, you will be required to use specific options for that command, and in some you won't. Typically, an option is used to change the behavior or slightly alter the way that a command works by default. In our next chapter, we will learn about figuring out what those options mean and how to determine what options are available for a command. Okay, so here we're going to go over how to write a command on the shell command line. This is the shell command line, and this is your command prompt. Anytime you see your command prompt, you know that you are basically at a point where you are ready to type a command. So the first thing that's going to be on the command line is called the command. Everything that comes after that is considered an argument. And every command can have anywhere from 0 to an infinite amount of arguments. It really just depends on the application and how it was written and how it was designed. The arguments may be, a file name or an option, and as you'll see when we go through different examples, that'll just depend on what type of command you're using. In this example, if you look here in this directory, I use the ls command just to get a listing of what's in this documents directory. With the default command prompt here, this lists the name of the directory you're currently in, so that's how I knew I was in the documents directory. I'm going to use the copy command, and I'm going to use the copy command to copy this file called my file into another file called your file. So the first thing I'm going to type is cp. Cp is the command that we use to copy files or directories. Then I'm going to put a space, and it's important to understand that when you're typing commands, a white space character, any amount of white space, either a space character or a tab character, separates each individual token or word on the command line. So now that I've inserted white space, I can type in my first argument, which is going to be the file that I want to copy. Then I'm going to insert more white space, and then type the name of the new file that I want to copy it to. So when I run this command, and I do a listing again using ls, you can see that I now copied my file into a new file called your file. So that command consisted of one command, cp, and two arguments. The first argument was my file. The second argument was your file. And as you can see, both are separated by a single space character. Next, I'm going to actually use an option with the cp command. So I'm going to use the taci option. We want to look at what the taci option is here. So the taci option for cp makes it prompt you before you overwrite something, just in case, because Linux is not very forgiving, especially if you're the root user. It will let you delete and overwrite anything without warning unless you tell it that you want a warning. Pretty much the complete opposite from a Windows operating system. So when I try and copy this again with the taci option, then I'm going to put my file, another space, and then your file. Now we have three arguments to the cp command. Taci is the option that says prompt me before you overwrite something. So now when I run that command, you'll see that it asks me the question, are you sure you want to overwrite your file? And so here I would either answer yes, Y for yes, or N for no, and it will copy it. Next, we're going to look at another command called grep. And with the grep command, what we're going to do is we're going to use an option with grep. Grep is a command that you're going to use quite frequently. It's basically used to search for strings within a file or within the output of another command. If we look at taci, we'll see that that option says ignore case. So it will make it search for a string without caring whether or not a single character is lower or uppercase. So if I type the command grep space taci, that's my first argument, which is an option, and then I'm going to type what I want to search for. In this case, I want to search for the word student. What do I want to search in? I want to search inside the file /etc/passwd, often referred to as just etc password. This file is the file that contains all user account information on the system. I'm currently the user student, as you can see here on the command prompt, student. So what I'm doing is I'm just looking for the entry that has my account information in it inside of the etc password file. So as you can see, it worked, and it shows me here the word that I searched for, which was student. And if you notice, I searched for a capital S on student. Linux is case specific, so if I were to search without the option, I wouldn't get a return. So it's important to remember that, especially if you've never worked on Linux systems that much in your past. Case matters when you're in Linux. They're two completely different letters, especially when you're trying to find a file or you're trying to type a command. If you type the wrong capitalization or the wrong case, it's not going to work as expected. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how commands are formatted on the command line and what separates the command and each individual argument after the command using white space.